Start recording here. Okay, so race and ethnic inequality in the United States of America. Some of the things we're going to be taking a look at: minority, racial, and ethnic groups. We'll talk about what it means to be a minority group. We'll examine concepts of prejudice and discrimination. Take a look at the three sociological perspectives: functionalism, conflict, and interactionist, on race and ethnicity. We'll examine the spectrum of intergroup relations, ways in which groups can interact. Take a kind of a specific look here in the United States of America at race and ethnicity, and then we'll examine immigration on a global scale. So, questions we're going to be addressing here: what is prejudice? How is it institutionalized in the form of discrimination? In what ways have race and ethnicity affected the experiences of immigrants? And what are the fastest growing minority groups in the United States today? So, when we talk about race and ethnicity, the first thing we need to understand is that both of these are actually socially constructed categories of people. The difference is that racial groups tend to focus on an obvious physical characteristics, and ethnic groups are more about a shared cultural heritage, including things like language. So the reason I say both of these are socially constructed is because when we look at the difference between people on the basis of race, we tend to focus on skin color. However, we could have focused on eye color or hair color, and they would be equally valid because it's an arbitrary selection of a physical characteristic. So imagine how different race would be if we had, say, the blue eyes versus the brown eyes, or if we were talking about blondes, brunettes, and redheads with regards to racial groups. So, ethnic groups are groups set apart because of national origin or distinctive cultural patterns. But these are not completely discrete categories. There is overlap in the ideas of race and ethnicity and the way that they get employed. If you think about Latino, Hispanic, there are physical characteristics that get focused on there: a little bit darker skin tone, darker hair tone. However, the words Latino and Hispanic themselves reference specific linguistic origins. Hispanic means Spanish-speaking. Latino means anybody coming from a Latin-based language, which would include French and Italian and Portuguese in addition to just Spanish. So, again, when we think about like Native Americans, we're really talking about kind of a racial group there. However, a lot of the focus is on ethnicity as well, languages, tribal customs, things like that. So there is overlap in these two ideas. In fact, race as a concept was not really applied to people prior to roughly the 14th, 15th centuries, when the peoples of Europe began exploring the rest of the world, and they noticed that there were people with differences. Pardon me. Prior to that, the idea of race was really very similar to what we use the word breed for now. It actually referenced different races of dogs, different races of cows, different races of things like that. So originally the word race was used in Europe to reference breeds. And if you go back about 1,000 years, people recognized that people had different skin colors, but they did not make that an arbitrary group affiliation the way that we do when we talk about race. In the Roman Empire, there were people who had light skin, who had dark skin, but that was not how people were viewed. They may have been noticed because of skin color, but it was more about whether you were a citizen or not. And even what we would call racial minorities today could become Roman citizens. So the whole idea of race is a more recent phenomenon. Really, when we talk about like ideas of race, we're talking after about 1500 or so, contemporary. Okay, minority group. It's not just about the number of people. When we talk about majority and minority, we're not talking about the larger and the smaller group. Minority groups have characteristics. They have significantly less control and power over their own lives. Oftentimes, the status of being a member of a minority group is externally applied. So it's not about which group is smaller. It's about which group has power in society. We can talk about women in the United States of America, and there's a reason they're referred to as a minority group, and it has nothing to do with the relative size of males and females in our society. It has to do with who holds political, economic, and social power. So minority groups are groups that are disadvantaged. And the clearest representation of this when we talk about race, if we look at the country of South Africa, roughly 20% of the population of the country of South Africa it would be called white, and 80% would be called black, according to the terms we use, the way we use them in the United States of America. However, the white, the smaller group, the 20%, they're the ones that have all the economic and political and social power in South Africa. So the larger group is actually the minority group there. So don't think just numbers when we talk about minority groups. It's important to understand that it has to do with access to power and control over your own life. Some of the properties include unequal treatment, physical or cultural traits, whether it be skin color or shared language. Ascribed status, if you remember from the chapter when we talked about status, ascribed status is a status you're born with. Achieved status is a status you work towards. Minority status tends to be ascribed. It tends to be race, ethnicity, gender, disability, sexual orientation. These can all create minority status. And all of these are widely accepted to be things that people are born with, even with regards to sexual orientation. Most of medical groups and psychiatric groups and psychological groups do recognize that sexual orientation is something people are born with. Solidarity, which is a shared kind of connection with other people in the group and a shared understanding of experiences that members of that group suffer that other people in society may not. In-group marriage, which would be referred to as endogamous marriage. Endogamy, E-N-D-O-G-A-M-Y, is a pattern whereby groups marry, people marry within specific groups. When we get to the chapters on family, we'll talk more about endogamy and exogamy with regards to marriage. So I mentioned that race is something that's socially constructed, right? Society socially constructs which racial differences are important. The one that we have selected kind of on a global scale with regards to race really has to do with skin color. And if you think about like 19th century vernacular, especially with reference to Asian people and Native American people were referred to as red, having red skin, although that term does have connotations beyond that. It is actually a negative term because red skin refers to the scalp that is proof of an Indian kill in the 18th and 19th century. So, but people applied that to skin color as well. When they talk about Asians in the 19th century, they were referred to as the yellow horde. Of course, we have white and black, so we can see that skin color really is kind of the socially constructed difference that we tend to focus on when we talk about race. Racial formation is a socio-historical process in which racial categories are created, inhibited, transformed, and destroyed. Now, that's a mouthful, but kind of an easy way to explain that is initially in the United States of America, if you go back to the colonial period, what it meant to be white was not simply about skin color. Irish people, Italian people, German people were not originally considered part of the white race in the United States of America. You may have heard a term WASP, which refers to White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So initially in the United States of America, what it meant to be white didn't just include a physical characteristic. There was also a linguistic characteristic and a religious component. You had to be the proper religion. You had to be from England, which is what Anglo-Saxon references. You had to be Protestant, and you had to be white. So initially, being white in the United States of America, and even into the 19th century, being white in the United States of America included more than just your skin color. It was a process through the 19th and early 20th century whereby other white European groups, Italian, Irish, French, German, Norwegian, Scandinavian, that area, all these people had to go through a process of assimilation in order to become part of the dominant white group, because initially they were viewed as other races. So really race is a historical process as well. And when we think about the formation of African American or black as an identity in the United States of America, that has to do with historical process as well, because of things called like the octoroon rule or the one-drop rule, which essentially said, regardless of who your father was, your mother's condition determined whether you were free or slave, whether you were white or black in the United States of America. Slavery was an inherited caste. And people who had mixed racial parentage, in fact, someone like Barack Obama, who has a black father and a white mother, technically would have been considered white during this period of time because it was all about who your mother was. Of course, the most common pattern here in the United States of America would have been male plantation owners having sexual activity with female slaves, and that's why they focused on the mother's race determining the offspring's race. So we can see here that these change across time. They're created, they're inhibited, they're transformed, and eventually they can even become destroyed. Like Irish as a separate race, that concept no longer exists, and people with Irish heritage are now really just considered part of the dominant white race in the United States of America. Native Americans have gone through a number of periods where they were considered closer and farther from being part of, assimilated into being part of the white race. Initially, in the United States of America, Native Americans were actually, like during the 18th and 19th centuries, were actually considered socially higher in status than African slaves were. And there was a big push encouraging Native Americans to assimilate into U.S. society. I mentioned the one-drop rule, which meant that one drop of African blood was enough to make you black in U.S. society. That's what the one-drop rule actually references. Currently, on the U.S. Census, you're actually allowed to select up to 3 distinct racial or ethnic heritages. I want to say that began on the 2000 census. That should be 1890, by the way, not 1990. W.E.B. Du Bois was an African American who talked about the color line being the foremost problem of the 20th century. So that should read 1890, not 1990, because Du Bois was working with the Chicago School in the latter half of the 19th and early part of the 20th century. And he said that the problem of the color line was going to be the biggest problem. If we think about immigration from Latin America, this shows the fluid nature of race formation simply because in the United States of America, a lot of social researchers tend to look at race as being white, non-white. And so it's not necessarily white and black and other, it's white and other almost. So the fact that a lot of Hispanics and Latinos are conflated kind of with minority status shows the fluid nature and the fact that there's this idea of white, non-white in the United States of America. The fact that Latinos are now the largest minority group in the United States of America, they have actually surpassed African Americans. And the numbers are roughly, people claiming Hispanic or Latino heritage are roughly 16% of our population, and African American is roughly 13% of our population. But we went during kind of the early part of the 20th century, especially following the acquisition of Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas as United States territories, we went from being a biracial society to a triracial society. There's a researcher right now, her name is Jennifer Lee. She's been doing research on looking at Asian assimilation into white society in the United States of America. She believes that as Asians and Latinos overcome the language barriers, it's easier for them to assimilate in, and she's actually developing a theoretical approach where she believes it's not so much white, non-white, as it is black, non-black in the United States of America, as a historical legacy of the absolute low status of African slaves in early American history. So there's all kinds of ways to kind of look at race in the United States of America. What's most widely used right now really is kind of the idea of triracial, looking at the minority groups, Latino, African American, and then the majority group, white. And so a lot of people tend to view the society that way. Asians tend not to get talked about as much when we discuss minority status, simply because of the phenomenon where they're referred to as the ideal or the model minority, the minority that never asked for affirmative action programs, has never challenged the dominant group in U.S. society, but has really just kind of tried to assimilate in. Now, one of the things that happens when we begin to think of people as part of a group instead of as individuals is we begin using stereotypes to predict and understand behavior. The problem with using stereotypes, and there are both negative and positive stereotypes, but the problem with using stereotypes is that they're unreliable generalizations that ignore individual diversity and variation. 85% of the difference that occurs between one person and another person occurs on an individual basis outside the genes that lead to lighter or darker skin tone that are associated with race, or even the genes that are associated with being male or female. The widest variation happens on an individual basis. So anytime we're ignoring individual variation, we're using unreliable generalizations. Okay, ethnicity. This is the shared cultural heritage, including language. So it's a group set apart primarily because of its national origin, as opposed to an obvious physical characteristic. As I said earlier, though, these are not completely discrete categories, and there is a lot of overlap. So the distinction between racial and ethnic minorities is not always clear-cut. Are Hispanics a racial minority, or are they an ethnic minority? And how do we deal with people who have African heritage but come from Hispanic countries, like Sammy Sosa? You know, is he Hispanic or is he black? And there's overlap in there. So just kind of wanted to point that out. that while we may talk about them periodically as discrete categories, they're not, and there is overlap between them. However, the distinction between race and ethnicity is socially significant. It is easier for ethnic minorities to assimilate than it is for racial minorities to assimilate, because ethnic minorities, it's just about learning language and culture. Racial minorities do have the physical characteristic that sets them apart. So that's why it says it's not always clear-cut, but it is still socially significant. Okay. Moving on now, we'll discuss some ideas about prejudice and discrimination in U.S. society. Prejudice is a negative attitude towards an entire category of people, usually highlighted by ism at the end of the word. Racism, sexism, ageism, classism, ethnicism. The only one that is not this way is feminism, because feminism itself is simply a social movement advocating for equality between men and women, social, political, and economic equality. But when we talk about racism, we're talking about one race thinking it's better than another race. When we're talking about ethnicism, one ethnicity thinking it's better than other ethnicities. Ageism, certain ages are considered better than other ages. Sexism, of course, is the idea that one sex is superior to other sexes. And these are all kind of prejudicial attitudes. So prejudice is a negative attitude towards an entire category of people that does not account for individual variation. Now, I mentioned ethnicism, which is the belief that one ethnicity is better than another. Ethnocentrism is an ingrained response in people whereby they tend to assume that their own culture is the right and proper way to live, the normal way to live, and other cultures that deviate from that are in some fashion inferior. So, for example, if we look at the act of consuming animal flesh for sustenance of life as a behavior, a lot of societies have that. But when we think about sitting down to eat a steak versus sitting down to eat something from a dog, carved off a dog, from a behavioral standpoint, there's no real difference there. That shudder that runs up your spine when I say sitting down to a meal of dog, that's your culture, your ethnocentrism, saying, oh, it's okay to eat cow, it's not okay to eat dog. And it can be unconscious, you know. Culture shock is one way we know that we're kind of dealing with some ethnocentric attitudes. If we feel like that shock, that sense of dislocation from being exposed to different cultural practices than our own, there we see our ethnocentrism coming into play, because our assumption is that the culture we were raised in is normal. So racism, belief that one race is supreme and others are innately inferior. The racism, there's all kinds of racism that exists. You can have, different forms of racism. The racism that has social consequences is racism with white superiority. And that's because whites in the United States of America are the dominant group, the group that has the political, social, and economic power. So that's kind of the racism. White racism is the racism in the United States of America that has social consequences. One way we can examine prejudice and discrimination is looking at hate crime statistics, because this gives us an idea of how much problem there is going on within a particular part of society. How much crime is there committed against this group or that group? So that's why we want to look at hate crime statistics, because they give us an idea of how much racism and how much kind of identity problems there are in the United States of America. Colorblind racism. This is kind of an interesting term because this is the idea that we need to use race neutrality to define racially unequal status quo. An example of that would be somebody with my characteristics. I'm white, I'm male, I'm heterosexual, so I'm really part of the majority, and I always find it kind of interesting that, you know, being who I am, I have to talk about minority status of other groups. However, if I was somebody who said, you know, we don't need programs like affirmative action because there's no more racism in the United States of America. It's a self-serving position because there is racial discrimination still in the United States of America. And so for somebody from the dominant group to kind of use these race-neutral terms is just a way of protecting their favored status without saying, I deserve it because I'm white, using racist terms. So colorblind racism is using race-neutral terms to kind of justify racist ideologies in a certain sense. And the idea that society should be colorblind does perpetuate racial inequality, because as soon as we say race doesn't matter in U.S. society anymore, we're ignoring the 400 years of history that still mean that the majority of wealth in the United States of America is concentrated in the hands of white people. The majority of political power in the United States of America is still concentrated in the hands of white people, and overwhelmingly white male. If you look at the makeup of Congress, there's 535 seats in Congress. I want to say between 85 and 90% of them are occupied by white males. And a lot of people kind of get a little confused about that, because when I say that white males hold the power in society, I'm not saying that every single white male in the United States of America shares in that distribution of power. What I'm saying, though, is that even though I am not one of the people that serves in Congress or that, you know, controls a lot of economy, what I share in common with them makes them more sympathetic to me than it does to other people. Does that make sense to everybody? Anybody have any questions so far? If not, I'm just going to continue moving on here, okay? Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay. The color line is still in place, even if more people refuse to acknowledge its existence. If you are a minority person in the United States of America, you have more obstacles in your path to being successful than I do. Because I'm white, I'm male, I'm heterosexual, and I actually come from a I'm middle class too. I actually come from a college-educated background. Both my parents had college degrees. Okay, that's prejudice. Discrimination is actually the denial of opportunities and equal rights to individuals based on group affiliation again. So, one of these two things, prejudice and discrimination, is really for the most part legal, and one of these things is illegal. And the way it breaks down is prejudice, for the most part, is legal until you cross the line into actual hate speech. You're free to believe, you know, whatever you'd like to believe about the races, about gender, about sex, all this kind of thing. Sexual orientation, you are free to believe, you know, whatever you like. You're not free to put those beliefs into action. So discrimination is actually the one that's primarily illegal in the United States of America. However, it still exists. A lot of discriminatory practices have been outlawed, but it becomes very difficult to prove sometimes that these practices are going on, especially something like the practice of redlining, which is where a real estate broker draws a red line around a particular neighborhood on a map and says, don't sell to minorities in that area. Unless you get your hands on the map, it's hard to make the claim that you've been discriminated against by a real estate agent. So it's illegal, very hard to prove, though. The glass ceiling is one way that this can kind of, the phenomenon referred to as the glass ceiling is one way whereby a group can prove that discrimination exists. In fact, Walmart, on the basis of gender discrimination, actually had a lawsuit filed against them because they did not have qualified individuals from qualified females as general managers of any of the stores. So it can be gender, race, or ethnicity, but essentially the glass ceiling is a barrier that qualified individuals run into on their way up the hierarchy of an organization. And they'll run into a barrier where they can no longer get promoted over that. And it's accompanied by glass walls, which promotes lateral movement into tracks where you might be able to then again move up in a hierarchy. And what's referred to as the glass escalator, which is the fast tracking of white males into promotion over, they're getting promoted over qualified individuals that have a minority status. White privilege. I was discussing a little bit of that. White privilege itself is the benefit that everybody who is white shares in simply by being part of that group. Rights or immunities granted to people as a benefit or favor simply because they are white. One of the things that's kind of going on that's controversial right now, a lot of minority group members, especially in the African American communities, are talking about the police policing people differently on the basis of their race. Trayvon Martin, of course, that was George Zimmerman. He was more security than police. But if we think about like Michael Brown and Eric Gardner and Tamir Rice, and I want to say, I can't remember his name, but there was one that was just recent. A lot of African Americans see the number of black males being shot, unarmed black males being shot by police as an example of differential justice, which is groups being treated differently. White people who are pulled over don't really have to worry about getting shot by the police in the same way that African American males do, according to the claims being made by some of these activists. And there's some evidence to support that as well. I have to be honest about it. There is some evidence that indicates black males are as much as 7 times more likely to be shot by the police than white males in U.S. society. And that's saying something when you consider that the white male population is roughly 7 times the size of the black male population in the United States of America. A lot of people are seeing that as an example of white privilege, but there are other examples as well. There was a researcher, her name is Deva Pager, who did research on hiring practices. She did it both Milwaukee and New York, and she was looking at how a criminal record played into hiring practices, but she was also looking at how race played into this. So she had 4 applicants. She had 4 applicant groups. And they were as similar as possible as far as education, experience, skill level, pay rate, all that other kind of stuff. The only place they varied was racially. There were white and black, and then having a criminal record, either not having a criminal record or having a criminal record. And what she was measuring is frequency of callback for a second interview. Interestingly enough, the effects of race are as strong as the effects of having a criminal record. In other words, a white applicant with a criminal record was just as likely to be called back for a second interview as a black applicant without a criminal record. Now, we either have to assume, as Deva Pager says, that everybody who was doing the hiring was willing to put their racist beliefs overtly into action and take the chance of getting caught and fired for it, or we're witnessing institutionalized racism or institutionalized discrimination, whereby White people have an unfair advantage in hiring practices. This is part of white privilege and part of institutional discrimination. Black people are unfairly disadvantaged with regards to hiring practices. And it results from the normal operation of society. It's not like you have policies in place that say, if you have two applicants, one white and one black, you give the job to the white person. In fact, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the revised one in 1968, both specifically prohibit that as a practice. So, we don't have any overtly racist policies, but sometimes the outcomes are overtly racist. That's institutionalized discrimination. Affirmative action is an attempt to reverse the effects of institutionalized discrimination. These are positive efforts to recruit minority members or women for job promotions and educational opportunities. In fact, the article we wrote about, or we will be writing about this week, dealing with Tim Wise's article on admissions at the University of Michigan, is dealing with all of these things, white privilege, affirmative action, and kind of taking a look at all of these concepts here. So this would be important stuff with regard to kind of look at with regards to the writing assignment for this week. Okay, moving on to our perspectives. Racial prejudice actually provides three functions to the dominant group, according to research or theoretical development done by Nash. If you have beliefs where white people are superior to black people, that provides the moral justification for maintaining an unequal society. Whether you're talking about actually having slavery, Jim Crow, or even more recently, Herrnstein and Murray kind of making a claim that allows moral justification for maintaining an unequal society. In a book called The Bell Curve, they make the claim that on the basis of racial characteristics, African Americans perform about one standard deviation lower on IQ tests than white people do. Now, Herrnstein and Murray ignored a whole host of social factors that go into that lower performance, and they basically say this is biology at work. It's been widely discounted simply because Herrnstein and Murray ignore the social forces that contribute to lower educational outcomes. So, but anyway, racism provides moral justification for maintaining an unequal society. It will also discourage subordinate groups from questioning their status. Part of the reason that subordinate groups have questioned their status in our society, despite the fact that we do have racist beliefs, is that in the government policy and in government documents, there is information and policy set forth that opposes having a stratified society on the basis of race. And so that's why we did have the civil rights movement, because there was a discrepancy between our ideology and the actuality of U.S. society. And then it encourages support for the existing order. So these are three functions that racism actually provides. From a functionalist perspective, slavery may be hard on an individual, but it provides benefit and function to society because it's providing free labor. So, of course, there are dysfunctions also provided by racism, and Rose, to oppose what Nash had done, came up with this. A society that practices discrimination fails to use the resources of all individuals. From my perspective, I think that what President Obama has done over the last 7 years that he's been in office, 6 or 7 years that he's been in, 6 years at this point in time, just over 6 years that he's been in office, he has actually managed to bring us out of the Great Recession and strengthen the economy. Imagine if we were still living in the Jim Crow era. We would have been denied all the talent that he brought to the executive branch. Discrimination aggravates social problems. When you look at the conflation between poverty and minority status, we see that minority groups in the United States of America, especially African Americans and Hispanics and Latino, are overrepresented in poverty. They're also overrepresented in prison populations as well. So when we look at poverty, the historical legacy of segregation and discrimination in the United States of America ensures that poverty is going to hit minority groups much harder than it's going to hit members of the dominant group. Another one. Society must invest time and money to defend barriers to full participation. Now, I'm going to break away from race here, and I'm actually going to focus on something that's a little different, which is the controversy surrounding same-sex marriage. If we think about investing time and money to defend barriers to full participation, the Supreme Court has ruled that having a constitutional amendment defining marriage as between a man and a woman at the state level is unconstitutional at the federal level. So Indiana's proposed HJR 3, which is House Joint Resolution 3, defining marriage as between a man and a woman, something that Indiana is trying to get through the House and, get through the Indiana legislature and then sign into law, has already been ruled unconstitutional. So should Indiana actually pass this, all that means is that we're going to be spending a lot of time and a lot of money defending this in court. So that's how society must invest time. That's one of the ways that society can invest time and money defending barriers to full participation. We would not spend millions of dollars on a court case if we were not considering trying to deny same-sex couples the right to marry in Indiana. Because right now with the Supreme Court rulings, it's actually legal here. Indiana has another law, the Religious Freedom Act, which just passed. And this is essentially the one that's going to allow businesses in Indiana to put up signs saying no gays allowed. We're going back to that kind of behavior. However, that will be ruled unconstitutional on the basis of the Civil Rights Act. Nevertheless, there's going to be a lot of time and money spent defending these types of barriers. And then racial prejudice undercuts goodwill and diplomatic relations between nations. A lot of countries view the United States of America as somewhat hypocritical when they want to talk about other countries and the way that they discriminate against minority groups, since the United States of America still has pretty clear patterns of prejudice and discrimination against minority groups on the basis of race and ethnicity. So that can undercut goodwill and diplomatic relations between nations. Okay. So the functionalist perspective is providing function, but it's also providing dysfunction. And remember, the functionalist perspective is all about whether or not a particular social arrangement contributes to social stability or destabilizes society. Moving on to conflict perspective, the first thing we come across is race exploitation or simply exploitation theory. Racism keeps minorities in low-paying jobs, supplying the dominant group with cheap labor. Essentially, minorities are exploited in our society as sources of cheap labor so that we can all enjoy a fairly good, fairly high standard of living. And so business owners can make higher profits. The problem with this is it doesn't explain all prejudice. This may explain low wages by businesses, but there's other ways that businesses have low wages too. It's not just they look at the age of people, and if they're teenagers, then they exploit them for that as well. for cheap labor. And this doesn't explain membership in white supremacist groups. So exploitation theory can only explain economic discrimination, prejudice and discrimination. It can't explain social or political prejudice and discrimination. Okay, then we get to labeling perspective. This comes out of the symbolic interaction approach. And labeling perspective essentially says that it is not about the actions of an individual, it's about how society reacts to an individual. So when we think about things like the Stop and Frisk Act policy in New York, you may have heard it referred to as the racial profiling law in New York. Essentially, the police have the right to stop and frisk anybody in New York City if they're acting suspicious. The problem is 90% of the people stopped and frisked under the Stop and Frisk program are either African American or Latino and male. So it's arbitrary action initiated based on race, ethnicity, or national origin. They're not really looking for suspicious behavior. What a lot of people say is that apparently having brown skin is suspicious behavior in New York because those are the only people that are getting stopped and frisked. Another way we could think about this, the labeling perspective. Following 9/11, 90% of the people selected for the so-called additional random security checks by the TSA either looked Arabic, had darker skin, or they had an Arabic-sounding name. So that's racial profiling. Arizona SB 1070, which was referred to as Arizona's racial profiling law, which says that if police stop somebody for whatever reason and then suspect that that person is Latino or Hispanic in origin, they have to make them establish citizenship then. So if I was pulled over by the police, if I was walking down the street by the police, I could give them my name and that would be it. They wouldn't have any right to ask me for ID or anything because I've identified myself. However, Arizona's SB 1070 says that if somebody who was Latino or Hispanic was in the same circumstances, the police would be required to make them establish citizenship. Something they wouldn't do to me because, well, let's say I have blue hair, blue eyes, and I sound American. So the practice is often based on explicit stereotypes, right? Everybody named Muhammad is somebody who wants to crash a plane. So anybody that has the name Muhammad gets selected for an additional security check. It's not something that's unpopular in the United States of America. There are a lot of people who believe ethnic and religious profiling of air travelers is actually beneficial. 53% of Americans favored it. In 2010, 9 years after the attacks on the United States of America. Another one is the contact hypothesis. And what the contact hypothesis is actually about, it's about reducing or lowering prejudice and discrimination. And what the contact hypothesis says is that if you get people working together in cooperative circumstances with favorable outcomes, that's what's left out of this particular slide here. It should say interracial contact between people of equal status in cooperative circumstances with favorable outcomes will cause them to become less prejudiced and to abandon old stereotypes. If they do not have favorable outcomes, it does not have that reductive power on prejudice and discrimination. They actually have to have positive outcomes. So if you're working on a group project with other students and you've got, a diverse group of students working on the group project and you get an A on that group project, contact hypothesis says that that will reduce prejudice and discrimination for everybody that participated in that project. However, If you all work together and you don't get a good grade on the group project, that does not reduce stereotyping and prejudice. So, how do majority and minority groups interact? How do racial and ethnic groups relate to one another? There are a number of ways. The first, of course, is what's referred to as genocide. And that is the elimination of one group by another group. The deliberate, systematic killing of an entire group of people. Expulsion is not as harsh as genocide, but is another extreme mean of acting out, where you just essentially say, all these people, we're going to kick them out of our country. Amalgamation. A majority group and a minority group combine to form a new group. And an example of this would be when the Spanish culture and the Aztec and Mayan cultures combine to form the Mexican culture, which has elements of both, but is not Spanish, nor is it pre-Columbian Native American culture wholly. Now, a lot of people tend to believe that the United States of America is a melting pot and that amalgamation is actually what's happening. That kind of fails as a description of what's going on in the United States of America for a couple reasons. One is, despite the fact that a third of our population is minority, only 6% of our population ever engage in what will be referred to as an interracial or mixed-race marriage. People tend to marry endogamously. Remember, we talked about that. The other thing is that really, if you want to get ahead in the United States of America, there's another pattern of interaction that really describes what you're going to have to do. And it's this one, assimilation. If you want to succeed in the United States of America, you're going to have to be able to speak English, and you're going to have to understand a lot of our cultural norms and cultural behaviors. So what really happens here is that a lot of immigrants first-generation immigrants encourage their children to discard their own culture and adopt the United States culture so that they can become successful in the United States of America, even though assimilation does not guarantee social acceptance. It tends to correlate more strongly with being accepted socially if you assimilate into U.S. society. Another way they come together, this is what we had during the Reconstruction period leading up to the Civil Rights era. We had segregation, what were referred to as the Jim Crow laws. Separate but equal facilities was the doctrine of the Jim Crow laws. The Supreme Court ruled that segregation was constitutional in 1898 in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Half a century later, in Brown versus the Board of Education, they ruled that segregation was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court in the late 19th century in Plessy versus Ferguson essentially ruled as long as you have separate but equal facilities, segregation does not violate constitutional rights. In 1954, what happened was the Supreme Court said, well, what we've seen is that the reality of the situation is that there are never equal facilities. The facilities are always separate. They're never equal. Therefore, you are giving one group disadvantage. That's why it became unconstitutional. So when we think about segregation, the dominant group imposes pattern on a minority group. We talked about Jim Crow. Apartheid was the official segregationist policy of the Republic of South Africa. Whereby whites held all the political, social, and economic power, and blacks were really just kind of managed as a source of cheap labor, even though they were 80% of the population. Pluralism. This is another pattern of interaction that people feel may describe the United States of America, based on mutual respect among various groups. All cultures have equal standing according to this. Ideally, yes. Ideologically, yes. The United States of America is pluralism, a pluralist society. However, that is just not the reality of the situation. There are a lot of people that oppose more than one language being used in the United States of America, which is kind of interesting because the official language of the United States of America is, and that's a trick because the United States of America doesn't actually have an official language. The dominant language, of course, is English, but the United States does not have an official language, despite what some politicians may say. One politician during the last kind of primary season was asked about Puerto Rico becoming a state, and essentially said, well, I think that's fine as long as they're willing to learn the official language of the United States of America. It's a little hard to do when we don't have one. Switzerland is much more of a pluralistic state than the United States of America. They actually speak 3 different languages. All 3 of them are official languages. German, French, and English are all official languages in Switzerland and all recognized by the government. All right, taking a look specifically here at race and ethnicity in the United States of America, when we look at this, 1 out of every 4 blacks is poor. So if we say that the population of the United States of America, the African American population, is 13%, they are heavily overrepresented in the poor in the United States of America. 25% of the black population lives in poverty compared with roughly 10% of the total population. So they're really overrepresented there. I think I discussed that a little bit, the idea of socio-historical forces. It's not just discrimination now. It's actually a historical legacy. So the contemporary discrimination faced by African Americans grows out of the historical legacy of slavery in the United States of America. Social movement, which was kind of a countercultural movement, the Black Power movement, rejected the goal of assimilation into white middle-class society. It's not the first time there has been a dispute over how to achieve racial equality amongst the African American community. If we go back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we will find that Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois had very different ideas about how to achieve equality for that minority group. Booker T. Washington was advocating his politics of accommodation, which was very popular with the white population in the United States of America, because the politics of accommodation essentially stated in order for blacks to achieve equality, all they have to do is keep their heads down, go along with what's going on, and eventually the white people will recognize them as being deserving of equality. W.E.B. Du Bois kind of said, no, equality is something you have to fight for. It's not something that will ever be given to you. And so he had a policy of where he said the African Americans need to pool their resources and get about 1/10 of their population educated in academic disciplines, and this would be the talented 10th, Du Bois said, would lead the rest of the African American population to equality in the United States of America. So, but anyway, in the 60s, Black Power was a group exemplified by Black Panthers and others that kind of started a social movement rejecting the goal of assimilation into U.S. society. Life chances is a term that Max Weber uses to discuss, or created to discuss, the opportunities that an average person born into particular circumstances will have to achieve success in U.S. society. Blacks suffer in terms of their life chances because of institutional discrimination in U.S. society. It is harder for minorities to kind of achieve at the same level as whites. Native Americans, a group that we can use the word genocide when discussing, because in the year 1500, it's estimated that just in the continental United States of America, there were approximately 10 million Native Americans living in about 600 different tribal cultures. By the year 1900, that number had been reduced from 10 million to 250,000. It was down to 600,000, close to 1,800. But by 1900, it was down to 250,000. The population has grown since then to about 2.5 million now. However, a lot of that growth occurred as people who were formerly kind of assimilated into the white group began claiming Native American ancestry, some of it, unfortunately, to participate in the profits from the Native American casinos. There are about 2.5 million Native Americans now, representing an array of cultures, distinguishable by language, family organization, religion, and livelihood. It's about 554 distinct tribal groups in the United States of America. Not every Native American group has what's referred to as Indian or Native American gambling. Where it does happen, though, those tend to be prosperous reservations where you don't have gambling. Life on the reservation is poor, some of the poorest lives lived in the United States of America. Native Americans living on reservations face unemployment that can be 50% and can go as high as 90% on the reservation. Lots of health problems, low educational and employment outcomes on reservations that don't have Native American gambling. Asian Americans, one of the fastest growing segment of U.S. population. I believe it's up to about 6% of our population at this point in time, and it continues to grow. When we talk about Native American, Asian American, Hispanic American, these are what are referred to as pan-ethnic or identities. They're identities that cover a diverse group with a lot of cultural variation in there. If we think about Latino or Hispanic, we can use that when we talk about people from Puerto Rico, people from Mexico, people from Cuba, people from Colombia, people from Costa Rica, people from Belize, people from Ecuador, people from Honduras, Argentina, Chile. I can go on and on and on, because the majority of nations speak Spanish and are part of the Hispanic culture in Latin America. Asian Americans, it's the same kind of thing. Chinese, Korean, Vietnam, Laotian, Cambodian, Japanese, and then even including the Indian subcontinent, who are part of the group referred to as Asian Americans. So you have India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh as well. And then some areas kind of in between, Burma, Thailand. These are all part of the Asian American population. So it is a very diverse group. I mentioned before that it's held up as a model or ideal minority, and the reason for this is that they've managed to achieve a degree of success without overtly challenging the dominant group in the United States of America or without affirmative action programs of assistance. It's a minority group that succeeds economically, socially, and educationally without the need for confrontations. Originally, Chinese Americans were welcomed in the United States of America as a source of cheap labor in the West while the railroads were being built, the Pacific railroads were being built. There had been immigration earlier than 1850, but in 1849, Legends of the Mountain of Gold reached China, and you saw a spike in immigration. After the railroads were finished, the white group in the United States began to view immigrants from China problematically. This led to the Exclusion Act of 1882, which became implemented in 1888 after it was passed and ratified. There was no legal immigration from China at that point in time. Currently, there are approximately 3 million Chinese Americans, representing the largest group of Asian Americans, one of the largest groups of Asian Americans, but Chinese Americans, it is hidden, but there is a lot of poverty that runs rampant through Asian American communities, especially Chinese American communities. So many Chinese immigrants struggle to survive under living and working conditions that are really exploitative and belie the model minority stereotype. Immigrants from India are the second largest group, roughly 2.6 million. They are also considered Asian Americans. The newer immigrants try to practice their religion just as they did in India. However, this becomes problematic for them. First of all, as their children are exposed to U.S. culture and they realize that arranged marriage is not the norm in U.S., arranged marriage is still the norm for a lot of people in India. It's part of the Hindu religion, as is caste, having a system of castes. So maintaining these family traditions becomes problematic because in the United States of America, we oppose the idea of religious-based castes anymore. Okay, Filipino Americans, a lot of them showed up here following the Spanish-American War because Philippines were one of the 4 territories that America was granted following the Spanish-American War. I want to say it was the Philippine Islands, Guam, Cuba, and Puerto Rico were the 4 territories that the U.S. acquired following the Spanish-American War at the beginning of the 20th century. There was a large number of immigrants that came here. They're the 3rd largest Asian American group. And when it was an American territory, they were coming here the same way that people from Puerto Rico come here. They are already nationals. They're already considered citizens of the United States of America. There is no process they have to go through to get a visa or anything. Filipinos had to go through. Puerto Ricans currently do not have any process they have to go through to get a visa. They are American citizens because they live in an American territory. A significant percentage of Filipino immigrants are well-educated professionals. We find this when we look at Latin Americans. We also find this with Cuba. So we also have Vietnamese Americans. Came to U.S. primarily during and after the Vietnam War. There was a large population of them that settled around Burlington, Vermont. Unusually, Vermont, as pretty much a homogeneous white state, has been very welcoming of immigrants. In the 70s, welcoming people from Vietnam. In the 90s, welcoming Bosnian refugees. And most recently, also the Lost Boys of the Sudan, the refugees from Darfur and Rwanda. And also recently, Vermont has said they would take in people coming from children fleeing the warring in Latin American nations. So they gravitated towards larger urban areas. Korean Americans, 1.3 million. Korean Americans exceed Japanese Americans in terms of population. There are less than 1 million people who identify as Japanese Americans. Korean Americans tend to be overshadowed by other Asian groups. There was an initial wave between 1903 and 1910, a second wave after the Korean War in 1953, and then following the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, there was a third wave of Korean immigration that began. Japanese Americans, very, very small numbers, as I said, 100,000, a little more than that maybe. They divide themselves into groups based on terminology. Issei would be the first generation of Japanese immigrants. They also have Nisei, Honsei, and some others that indicate, I think they go up to the 5th generation. And then the Kibei, I believe it's Kibei, are Japanese immigrants who returned to Japan for formal schooling. Of course, Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps during World War II. Which was kind of a negative experience for them. It was based upon an incident that happened in Hawaii, whereby there was a pilot from Japan who crashed, and a 3rd-generation Japanese family took him in and protected him because they were afraid that he was going to be tortured if he was found out. But when this became discovered, Japanese Americans were forced into camps. So yeah, you have the Issei, the Nisei, or the 2nd generation, Sansei, 3rd generation, Yonsei, 4th generation, and then the Kibei are the ones that, regardless of what generation, returned to Japan for formal schooling. In 1988, the U.S. established a $1.25 billion trust fund to pay reparations to Japanese Americans. Arab Americans, up to 3 million people of Arab ancestry reside in the United States of America. Contrary to what you might think, they are not Muslims. The majority of Arab Americans are actually Christian. At this point in time, I want to say something like 1.5 million or more. That cannot be characterized as having specific family type, gender role, or occupational pattern. In fact, it's difficult sometimes to even know who is an Arab American descendant because they have assimilated so well. For example, Ralph Nader, the consumer advocate, is actually has Arab heritage, but not a lot of people recognize that. Profiling potential terrorists has put Arab and Muslim Americans under surveillance, and there's a tendency to conflate Arab and Muslim in U.S., but as I said, the majority of Arab Americans living in U.S. society are Christian. The majority of Muslims living in U.S. society are African American, members of the Nation of Islam, or immigrants from Pakistan. The largest group of immigrant Muslims in the United States are actually from Pakistan, not from anywhere in the Middle East. Latinos, 16% of the population of the United States of America. They're the largest minority. More modest level of upward mobility than in past generations. Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans are the 3rd largest group. Cuban Americans are the 3rd largest group of Latinos in the United States of America. Mexican Americans are close to 10% of the total U.S. population. A lot of Mexican families found themselves citizens of the United States of America without ever moving a step. Following the end of the Mexican-American War, when America, I believe, for the price of $25 million, purchased California, New Mexico, Arizona, and then had already acquired Texas as well. Immigration continues to go on. A lot of people immigrating from Mexico come across the border in any way they can get here. They don't worry about whether it's legal or illegal. And immigration, the pattern of immigration was actually, believe it or not, set up by the U.S. government under a program, a guest worker program, began in 1942 and continued until 1964, called the Bracero program. But there are intense debates right now over the DREAM Act, which is President Obama's executive order designed to grant amnesty to a bunch of illegal immigrants, bilingual education, the way that bilingual education happens in the United States of America essentially is that children are taught in their own language until they can get up to speed in English, but that still is controversial and a lot of people oppose that. Latinos, they share heritage of Spanish language and culture. Now, there are other countries, other languages in Latin America. In Haiti, in French Guiana, they speak French. Brazil, they speak Portuguese. But generally, most people include these in when they talk about Latin America, even though they don't share the Spanish language aspect of that. So, Mexican Americans, family is very important. A lot of traditional family values. You find more traditional family values amongst Mexican Americans and amongst Latinos in general than you do amongst white Americans. But aside from family, the Catholic Church is the biggest organization, and the Catholic Church is actually an organization that can facilitate immigration and assimilation for Mexicans coming into the United States of America. It helps them maintain, develop a sense of identity, and as I said, assist in their assimilation. Puerto Ricans, as I said, are American citizens. They do not participate in elections while they live in Puerto Rico. They do not even participate in the election for president. However, I know that at least the Democratic National Convention holds a primary in Puerto Rico, and I believe the Republican does too, although I'm not positive about the Republican. But when Puerto Ricans come into the United States of America, the continental United States of America, they are instantly American citizens. They have the right to vote as soon as they do that. Nevertheless, there's a large concentration of them in and around New York City and the Bronx and Brooklyn and those areas. And they experience serious poverty there. They also experience serious poverty on the island. In fact, it is poverty on the island that drives a lot of Puerto Ricans to come into the United States of America. Cuban Americans, really the big pattern of immigration began following the Communist Revolution in Cuba and Fidel Castro assuming power in Cuba. So we saw a different pattern of immigration here than we see from Mexico and Puerto Rico, where current immigration and immigration in the 20th century from Mexico and Puerto Rico was driven by the search for economic opportunity. Cuban Americans, beginning in 1959, were in large part professionals that owned property, and they were coming here fleeing political persecution. So many of them settled in Miami, Florida, and they tend to be the highest achieving group of Latinos in the United States of America. Cuban Americans have a median income that's over $50,000. So, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that lawyers, doctors, businessmen were the ones fleeing Cuba in opposition to unskilled labor fleeing Puerto Rico and Mexico. And then Central and South America, a lot of immigration from there, and it varies because when you look at countries like Argentina and Chile, they're more middle-income countries. And the people coming from there tend to be more professional than the people that might be coming from Colombia and Central America. There's a diverse population. They also, a lot of the countries down there employ what's referred to as a color gradient or a color spectrum, which is more the idea that there's a range of colors with regards to race. So they're not prepared for the line in the sand that we have here in the United States of America dividing white and black people. For example, in Brazil, they make distinctions between white, tan, brown, and black as different racial groups. Jewish Americans, outside Israel, the United States of America has the largest Jewish population of any country. And our population is actually, may even be a little bit larger than the population of Israel, because I believe there's roughly 7 million people living in Israel. And if you think about it, 2% of our population is 6 million people, so it's pretty close. Anti-Semitism, of course, is anti-Jewish prejudice. In the United States of America, being Jewish is not as much of a religious thing as it is a cultural thing. But even there, being Jewish is more of a cultural thing in the U.S. than a religious thing. But even there, people who are Jewish face the choice of maintaining ties to their long religious and cultural heritage, or really becoming indistinguishable from Gentiles, which are the non-Jewish population. White ethnics, Irish, Polish, Italian, Swedish, French, German. There's a lot of white ethnics that have come to the United States of America, but really the ones coming during the 19th century were minority groups when they first showed up. They were actually considered separate racial groups in the 19th century. In fact, if you look at if you ever dig up early American caricatures of Irish people, it looks very similar to what early 19th century like cartoonists did as far as caricatures of Irish people. It's very similar to what 19th century cartoonists did with regards to African American people. Now, when we talk about these ethnic groups, a lot of times they're encouraged to assimilate into U.S. society so that they can move up kind of in the status hierarchy here in the U.S. And so a lot of people don't understand their entire ethnic heritage. They have more of what's referred to as a symbolic ethnicity, where they may know current political conditions and they may understand cuisine, but they don't have deeper ties to their own ethnic heritage. So that's called symbolic ethnicity. Okay, right now, immigration is at an all-time high. There are major immigration patterns. And when we look at who's coming into the United States of America, a lot of it is coming from Asia and a lot of it is coming from Latin America. But worldwide, immigration is at an all-time high. In fact, the only growth happening in the U.S. population right now is because of net immigration. When we think about births and deaths, those are fairly stable in the U.S. society, and we have roughly as many people being born as die off every year. It's immigration, the fact that we have more people coming into the United States of America than we have leaving the United States of America, as the reason our population continues to grow. But when we think of mass migrations, where large numbers of people migrate all at once, maybe because of environmental conditions or political conditions, those can have tremendous social impact. Think about just in the latter half of the 20th century, how U.S. population has come to be viewed a little bit differently because of the increasing presence of Latinos, to the point where they are now the largest minority group. And when we look at the election of 2000, where George W. Bush was running against Al Gore, George W. Bush making an effort to go out and reach out to Hispanic voters, a lot of people feel that was kind of the difference there that made his campaign. So, moving on, one of the things that immigration can create are what's referred to as transnationals. And these are people who maintain ties in their original country and in their new country. So they begin to create a link between the two countries through the sustenance of these multiple social relationships. Since 1960, the U.S. has encouraged immigration if you have relatives in the U.S., part of the Immigration and Reform and Naturalization Act was creating a fast-track pathway for relatives of people who have already become citizens to move to become citizens as well, and then people that have specific professions, specific skills, like if we think about right now, there's a lot of people who work in computers that have easy access to move into the United States of America simply because we're not producing enough qualified graduates to fill all the jobs in Silicon Valley. So that would be one particular skill set, high-tech skill sets that are in demand in the U.S. economy. So when we think about applying, doing sociology and looking at this, most research indicates that immigrants adapt well to life in the U.S. once they kind of get past the whole assimilation thing. Immigrants do adapt well, especially if they're white ethnics, but most immigrants really find life in the U.S. better than life was in their home country. Immigration performs many valuable functions. Cultural diffusion. It actually provides, like I said, economic benefit because there are particular jobs that the U.S. is not producing enough qualified graduates to staff. However, conflict theory would look at that as creating brain drain in the country of origin and saying the people whose skills are here in the United States of America, their skills, if you think about like doctors and social workers and lawyers and high-tech people, those jobs that they do would provide much more benefit in their country of origin. Feminist perspective kind of takes a look at the way women become the people that connect the family to society. They're the ones that in general are saddled with the responsibility of getting children enrolled in school, doing the shopping, making arrangements for doctor, dentist, all that kind of stuff. So they're the ones that primarily become responsible for connecting the family to U.S. society. So when we think about policy, right now there's huge debate over what to do with the border on Mexico. It's a really, I want to say 1,500 to 2,000 mile border that provides all kinds of opportunity for illegal immigration. There was a 1986 act that actually outlawed hiring illegal aliens and provides for some fairly stiff penalties. If you have an illegal alien working for you, it can be a $15,000 fine per person who is here illegally working for you. The law I was referring to as the Arizona profiling law, Arizona SB 1070, is actually the Arizona immigration law. And so the fact that we still have this huge debate over the DREAM Act, over what's being done with illegal immigration, over sealing the border, reflects the fact that we are kind of ideologically engaged in a culture war over how to handle immigration. Okay, that concludes Chapter 11, our lecture for today. So before we get going here, does anybody have any questions at all about anything?
No.
All right, so that everybody can speak if they want to. I've turned on all the microphones. Or you can just type questions if anybody has a question at all. I don't see anything there, so if there are no questions, I will say everybody have a good week. Next Monday we'll be moving on, covering, I believe, chapters 12 and 13, which are gender and aging. And I will be back here at the same time, 2:30 Eastern, 1:30 Central, and I will do another one of these lectures for you then. Oh, by the by,
I forgot to say this. If you ever have email that you would like to email me a question, my email address is mhowell1. That's MHOWELL1 at ivytech.edu. I'm located at the Valparaiso campus. And I forgot to tell you, this is Matthew Howell. So if there are no questions, everybody have a great week, and hope to see you next week at our next lecture.